Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining. We still have a number of registrants joining the call, so I'm going to give them at least another 30 seconds before we kick off. And then we'll just see whether or not there are still a number of others joining. Hope everyone's having a good morning so far. I see some familiar faces have joined. Of course, I can't see your faces. And I'm sorry that I can't because they're always friendly, but I am glad to know that you're here. And thank you for signing up for the webinar today. Okay, we still have quite a few joining, so I'd like to give it another 15, 30 seconds or so before kicking off. Okay, well, it seems as though most of them are now in, and so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for your patience. All right, first, a couple of housekeeping items to go over. As you probably know, everyone will be on mute for the duration of the webinar. This session will be recorded, and everyone will receive an email with the call recording, and I believe the slide deck afterward. We'll have time for some Q&A toward the end of the session. So if any questions come up during our time together today, I highly encourage you to use the Q&A section button specifically where your Zoom tools are located to ask those questions. For any questions that we don't have time to answer by the end of the webinar, we will make sure to follow up with you in a timely manner. So many clients that I've already had the pleasure of working with have joined today's webinar, but for those of you who don't know me, hello, I'm Susan Whalen. I am a customer success specialist for Bullhorn overlay products such as analytics or onboarding talent platform or my biased favorite, automation. In customer success, our mission is to help you unlock value from your Bullhorn tech stack. I've been with Bullhorn for almost 3 years. This is my first time hosting a webinar, so I'm very excited, a tad nervous, but I'm hoping to deliver a meaningful presentation to you today. Okay, I'd like to call out that during today's presentation, I'll be sharing information and data in a demo environment. So none of it's real, it's for demo purposes only. And as you already know, today's Bullhorn Basics webinar will focus on business development best practices for automation. We'll cover business development ideas for new lead, active, and lapsed sales contacts, what I think is an exciting way to measure ROI of the product, and a great way to generate reviews. And then I'll also share some tips along the way. In general, business development automations are nurturing campaigns, each geared toward different audiences and perhaps further defined by a business vertical or a source or a category or any other criteria that makes sense to you. The list logic that you select to determine record enrollment will vary based on your unique internal processes. So let's start with new leads. Okay. So this is an example of an automation, we'll go through it in a fair amount of detail, that you might want to consider sending to new lead sales contacts. And what I did was I took one of the blueprints that exist in each of your instances, and I used that as a jumping off point. So to demonstrate, you probably are all familiar that if you build an automation, you can either start from scratch and choose whatever relevant entity you need to work with, or you can look through the blueprints it's a great resource for ideas for automations that might be of great value to you. You just haven't thought of, using them or building them yet. And these blueprints come over with suggested list logic for the record enrollment, suggested content for emails, suggested steps at certain cadences, perhaps a survey and a sample survey. So it comes over with all that information already embedded, but you can edit and alter all of it to your content, to whatever makes sense for you. So that's what I've done here. I took that Tallman 10-week sales process automation and edited it. I think I actually only have about 8 weeks worth of wait steps in it. But so just to give you an idea of what you might choose to include for list logic for a campaign like this, of course, you would consider whatever status is relevant. You might want to consider just records that were recently added, or you might kick this off after a certain point in time, whatever, again, makes sense. And here are some other criteria that may or may not make sense in your sales process. And, but the one helpful item to know is, I think I mentioned that this campaign lasts about 8 weeks. And so what I'm going to test for in the enrollment criteria is whether or not there's been any notes within the last 8 weeks. So that by the time they get to the end, I'll show you what happens there to determine whether or not records stay in this automation. I'm no marketing expert, but I do know, and as the blueprints suggest, that typically you start off with sort of an exchange of offering something of value to the recipient before asking them for information in exchange. And in this example, one idea would be, sorry, I wanted to segue and mention that in a candidate-based automation, you might be offering them a survey guide. Sorry, not a survey guide, a salary guide in your first overture to them, something of value. Another idea for on the sales contact side of things is everyone checks reviews, right? Millennials, Gen Zers, they don't order a cup of coffee without checking reviews. So your first overture might feature or include hyperlinks to social media review sites where they can, see all the great things that other clients and or candidates are saying about you. At present, we do have available some icons for some of the social media sites, and not necessarily all those that you might want to reference, especially for reviews. But I have put in a feature request to add to this list, and I've been told that we should be able to update this fairly quickly. But in the meantime, if you wanted to include a hyperlink to and include the image, there is a workaround where the content could just be to include the image for that social media site and then link the review page to the URL here within the content for that image. So that's a workaround that's available at the moment. And this is one way that you might want to start off. Or you might include that in a number of other campaigns or a number of other use cases. Another idea, some of our clients, I've seen them send out marketing collateral or swag to, new leads. Might be something small. And then after a week, maybe instead of sending an email, you send a text message, hope you enjoyed your gift or whatever it was that was received. Now, of course, you can only do this if you have an address for the recipient, right? So you could add into the list logic that they have an address, and you could approach testing for whether they do or don't a couple of different ways. I think the most straightforward and easiest way to do so is to build this initial automation, copy it, and edit the copy. This one runs for anyone who does have an address. The copy runs for those that don't. So obviously, for those that don't have an address, you won't be sending them these, you won't be sending an internal notification, perhaps to someone on your marketing team to send out these items, and you won't be using the send text step. But the two automations could run concurrently, same use case, just slightly different audiences, who does and does not have an address. You might continue on sending internal notifications to the recruiters to actually reach out and try to call these sales contacts and intersperse it with follow-up emails, perhaps a survey. At some point, you might try to see if you can extract some information from them that is of use to you. And if at the end, whatever time frame that might be, they are still in a new lead status. They haven't been, converted or transferred to another, to perhaps active status, or there has still have been no notes on that sales contact record for this entire duration to kick them out of the automation. Then you might decide to archive those particular records, and you might decide to add a note stating why you archived that particular record. So all of that could be done in this type of a campaign. I wanted to mention, that for any emails that you send out, you can do a little A/B testing, and by selecting, this option here, there is a knowledge base article that walks you through everything there is to know about A/B testing for emails. And if you did this at any point, you would, the system would determine which email was the winner, which one had the best responses, and then at some particular point, all future recipients would get the winning email. It doesn't have to be done in this type of a just this type of a campaign. It can be done in many, but just wanted to highlight that here. So moving on to ideas for active clients who are currently active. And I'm not going to preview an entire automation for that, because the automation could look very similar and just with different messaging. But if you wanted to isolate active sales contacts for any particular campaign, of course, you probably start off with their placement their status. And then you might consider a number of other criteria, whether they have any submissions within a certain time frame, or placements, or notes, or for those of you who haven't already discovered this section, whether they have any particular activity, such as viewing a page, or opening an email, or clicking on a link. If you want to test for any of those things specifically, or a couple of them in combination, you could add that in. Or in the alternative, and I'm sorry, here's the knowledge base article on all of those activity options. Or in the alternative, you could consider the automation score for each individual sales contact record. And so what is that? There's a knowledge base article that goes through all of the detail, and the score is a composite of activity generated from those records within automation, activity that relates just to how they're interacting with automations that they're running through. And it's a complicated algorithm that determines the score, but at any rate, what you could do if you wanted to consider quite a few different activities, instead of listing them all separately, since they are made up of those individual activities, you could just elect to use the score for that sales contact record instead. And you can determine, what number you want that score to be in order to enroll them in that particular automation. And next, I wanted to feature campaigns for lapsed clients. So these are clients with whom you have done business in the past, but not recently. And what recently means might differ to each of you. In this particular example, they still might be in an active status, but perhaps they haven't had any submissions or placements or notes on their record within, say, the last 3 years. And you can add in any additional criteria that makes sense to you. You could, again, have concurrent automations running where the messaging for one audience is slightly different than another based on other field criteria. And you might send them something like this as an example. Many of our clients feature their top candidates, often on as much as a weekly basis. And perhaps not only to this particular audience, but to many audiences in many automations. And why this is not cooperating at the moment, but hopefully it'll respond soon. But some of our clients manage this process by featuring the candidates in the body of the email itself that they send out. And so if they're editing this on a weekly basis, they need to pause the automation, go into that particular email and edit the content of that email to, change up whichever candidates they want to feature. Another idea could be that if you have a page that with that same information on your website, you could just send out in the email a link to a button, a hyperlink to that particular page, and then you never have to edit anything within the automation. You would just edit that page on your website instead. And along these same lines, I'd like to, introduce this idea of trying to determine value or return on investment from automation or your tech stack in general. So one way that you may have already discovered is that in each of your instances, you have a dashboard menu. And at the top, you can choose to view by a variety of timeframes the number of actions you've automated within that time frame. The total appears here, and the breakdown of what those actions were appears here. Then the system estimates how many man hours, how much time you've saved by automating those actions by taking this number and multiplying it by 2 minutes. And that's where they come up with the estimate for time saved. In this particular example, 240 man hours. You could then multiply that, that number by, say, an average salary for your organization, and you might come up with a value that way of how much time automation has saved you, and therefore, you're not spending money on man hours that way instead. So that's one option. Another option is you can measure the value in many instances of some of your campaigns specifically. And so earlier this year at Engage, Billy Davis and I presented on how to digitize your talent strategy using the connected recruiting playbook methodology. And toward the end of our presentation, we featured one of my clients who was very determined to measure ROI of automation in particular and the tech stack as a whole. And so In this particular case, the use case was on the candidate side, but I'll show you how we can do it on the sales contact side. But they targeted over 60,000 candidate records where they had done, they'd worked with these candidates in the past, they had had past submittals or interviews, but had not been contacted within the last 3 years. And then 4 months later, they tested for records that had run through that initial automation, and corresponding to those specific records, how much activity was generated from it. And they found that within 4 months, they had over 2,000 new job applicants, over 700 pre-screens, over 200 submissions, almost 40 client interviews, and 11 placements that equated to $250,000 of gross revenue. Enough to pay for not only automation, but the entire tech stack for an entire year. So they were able to measure that within 4 months, that one campaign generated that activity and that revenue and that return on investment. So how might we do so on the sales contact side of things, for example? We had already looked at this automation for lapsed clients, right? So similar, these are clients with whom, perhaps you've done business in the past, but not within the last, say, 4 years. So in this list, you would first test for whether or not the records had been through that automation, and then whatever activity you're looking for. Is the placement job status on the record placed? Or if you use job status instead, or any other criteria that makes sense. And then you don't actually have to even create an automation, just create the list. And then view those records that have run through this automation. In this case, we're not going to see any because it's a demo environment, but your results would appear here. And then you could export that information to a CSV file. You get many data points on that record, and you can correlate the information that way. So that might be a helpful idea for some of you. Then next, I'd like to segue to NPS surveys and actioning off of the results of those responses. So in each of your instances, again, back in the dashboard menu, if you send out NPS surveys, the results can appear in these dashboard cards. There is a specific NPS rating question type in our engagements. There is also a general rating question type. They're both rating questions, but only if you use this one, the NPS rating question, will the results filter into this dashboard card. And if you then follow that NPS rating question with a text-based response, any responses here will filter into this dashboard card. So that determines what information comes into this section of your dashboard. Now, that's great. You can come in here and look at rolling responses as they appear. But then also, of course, you can send, save any of the responses to a field on their record, and or send the responses to anyone in particular in your organization. And why might you want to do this in the first place? Well, it's a great measure of how well you're doing. It's a great way to determine any holes in your process, any gaps, areas that you're missing, any particular areas of great strength. It might shed a light on recruiters that need some remedial training in some shape or form, or those recruiters who are doing an absolutely fabulous job, and you're getting that feedback shared with you as well. So it's very helpful information. And in this particular example, where the use case is to send out this survey, you can do this on the candidate side and the client side, but to send out the survey at a certain point after a placement has actually taken place. So you could have records enrolling into this automation as soon as they occur. The placements just say a day old. And in this case, you would use a date-based automation to set the cadence for sending out the survey at any particular interval. In this case, 30 days after the placement start date. Just a couple of tips: whenever you have a date-based automation or you're using a date-based automation, it's best practice to include a wait step before the date in question, be it start date, end date, interview date, any of those. It's best practice to include a wait step beforehand to allow records to process through. And also, you might note that I don't have an end automation step here. And although you often don't need them, but they can be helpful and useful in some cases, especially in a date-centered automation, you do not want to use an end automation step. There's a knowledge base article on that also. And the reason is because often these dates in question can change, and you want to allow records to be able to move up and down, back and forth in an automation in the event that that date changes. So just a couple of things to point out there. So what I'm even more interested in, or as interested in, is gathering this information is to action off of the results. It's possible to do that here. You could send out the survey. You could add a wait step of any particular length. And then say you want to wait a week. And then afterward, test for anyone who's responded, what were their responses. The only problem with doing it this way is that all the records that were sent the survey will sit in this wait step for a week. So anyone that responds immediately, or after an hour, or after a day, or a few days, those records will still sit in this wait step for an entire week before any test of branching out based on response, whether it was negative, neutral, or positive. The way around that is to build a supporting automation that actions off of the results. And the only criteria would be that these records had taken that engagement, this engagement in this automation. And so then whenever they respond, and your enrollment criteria would be for every possible score that they could choose, so that whenever they respond, immediately, an hour, a day later, they enter this automation and the process begins. And you can often, our clients branch off of the results. They determine what they consider to be a negative NPS score, a neutral, and a positive. For many of our clients, whether it's negative or neutral, they're going to take the same exact action, and so they lump all of those into one branch. But if the action you take might differ at all between those two categories, you can have a branch for each, and then go from there. In this case, the suggested best practice is to send an internal notification to the recruiter, the recruiter's manager, anyone else in the organization, alerting them to the fact that this for this placement that just started 30 days ago, the sales contact has sent back a negative or neutral NPS score, and it's likely something that you would want to direct them to reach out, call, visit, and reach out directly, see what's gone wrong and turn that situation around. However, if you get a positive, some of our clients only use a 9 or a 10, a very high positive for this branch. You can fully automate responding to that sales contact and asking them perhaps for a review. We had talked earlier about how important reviews can be, that so many of your potential clients are going to check reviews on you. And so this is a great way to gather new reviews. So you could do something like send them an email saying, thank you for that score. We're so glad that you had a positive experience. And would you please leave us a review? Again, just as illustrated before, you can use the social media icons, or until some of those are available for these review sites, you can use an image and a hyperlink to create the same experience. Okay, so I'm just checking the time. We're at a little past the bottom of the hour. And I did promise that we would have time for some questions. And let's take a look. Let's see what we have. Just going to read through it quickly, and then I'll read it aloud to you. Okay, I need to think through this, but the first question reads, our system is very old, so a ton of our contacts are what Bullhorn considers a lead, or are just a receptionist contact and do not need to receive marketing. This is why we have not been using automations for our marketing, because we don't want to absolutely spam companies. What is the best way to fix this for old systems that did not have the newer level of contact hierarchy, or perhaps assigning a particular status or type of contact without spending of thousands of hours trying to correct it? Okay. So the marketing team is going to, give you a response to this. If I think it was asked anonymously, if you can go back to the questions, the Q&A section, and specify your identity so that they can respond, they will follow up with you specifically and make sure that whatever response is as relevant as it can be to your particular instance and your process. Another viewer asked, what automations have you seen used well on the client side? What campaigns tend to have the highest response rates? Well, again, any nurturing type campaign, and it doesn't have to be just those. You can have campaigns running on the client side, just as you hopefully do on the candidate side, alerting the sales contact to steps in the process where candidates are in that connected recruiting journey of applying for jobs, interviewing for jobs, being submitted. Any of those steps or processes that would be also of interest to your sales contacts that you would want to keep them notified about, and perhaps relieve the recruiter from having to do so manually. You can build automations that notify sales contacts of different steps in the process. And other than that, the ones that I've shared are some of the highlights. And the best response rates that I'm aware of tend to be to the more basic messaging, not wordy, not busy, and anywhere that you can offer them something of value or of interest at the same time tend to get the best response rates. And there are also some knowledge-based articles on email campaigns, best practices, and how to also avoid being identified as spam or junk. There's a couple of them that are very helpful. And that same viewer asked, would your search look at archived clients also? I'm not sure. I think Bullhorn Marketing is going to respond to this as well. And if you mean looking at archived records in order to run them through some sort of marketing campaign, my basic instinct is that if you archived them, you did so for a reason. You didn't have contact information, you didn't have viable or up-to-date contact information or something along those lines, and then you probably wouldn't be using those records in a particular campaign. So Luke has asked, please can you go through more of ROI for candidates placed and how to track? Okay, so if it helps, I'll go back to that particular example. And again, this is on the sales contact side. Hang on, I have an idea. Instead, let's do this. I'm going to go into the contacts menu. This is my favorite place to play around and look for information. You can build a list in the list menu. You can build a list on the fly while you're building an automation in the enrollment step, or you can come into the contacts menu, conduct an advanced search, and when you're happy with whatever criteria you've laid out, you can save it as a list. And while you're playing around, the actual records that fall into the list you're creating will appear here. You can go and look at them and test them to make sure you're capturing those that you want, not capturing people that you don't. You can also export that list at any time to a CSV file if you need further analysis to make sure you're capturing the right criteria. But in this particular case, it would be candidate-based automation, and you would look for candidates that had either, I think the example we used had been in an automation, and picking whichever automation you're trying to test the value of or the return on that investment. And then you would typically, sorry, I'm going to build this as a separate condition group. You would typically look for whether or not they have had any submissions. You could test for that individually and get a count. Let's see. And within the time frame that you're testing again, I think I had used like 4 months in the previous example. The count of the records would appear here. We're getting 0 here because I'm in a demo environment. But if you were testing it, the count would be for any candidate records that had passed through this brand new automation, and 4 months later, there's been a submission on those records. You could test individually for submissions, for placements, or does this one have, hang on. Sorry, I think the example I had spoken about was for interviews. And I don't have that option available to me in this demo environment. But again, be it interviews or any other criteria that you want to measure the success of against that campaign, you could build the list the same way that I did on the client side. And again, you don't have to run the list through an automation. You just conduct the search. You can save it as a list. This is kind of grayed out. It's a little bit hard to see. And then you could export those records to a CSV file for further analysis if that helps. Okay. So we're getting close to time. We do have more questions. We will run through each and every one of them. And if we have your information, if you've identified yourself, your account manager will get back to you with a response. And in the meantime, as Bullhorn customers, you have access to many resources, and you can click on either of these QR codes to access either a resources page or to book a demo. And as I mentioned, everyone will receive a follow-up email with a link to this recording and I believe the slide deck. So if you don't have time to access it right now, you'll be able to pull it up later when you get that response email. Okay, so thank you so much for attending. It was my pleasure to be your host today. I hope it's been helpful and informative. For any further information or assistance, please feel free to reach out to your account manager. And I hope you have a great rest of your week.